My name is Danielle Ferris. I'm 33 years old. My family ordered $4,000 of lobster at a restaurant I chose for my birthday, and when the check came, my mother slid it across the table to me and said, "You're paying, right? You picked the place." I hadn't ordered the lobster. I'd ordered a salad and a glass of wine, $42 total. What my family didn't know, what none of them found out until 3 weeks later, was that the restaurant I'd chosen for my own birthday dinner happened to be one I had a very specific, very useful relationship with. And I was about to use it. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever picked up a check you never should have had to pay, just to keep the peace, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. For as long as I can remember, my family has celebrated birthdays with a group dinner, my parents, my 2 older brothers, Mark and Trevor, their wives, and, once they arrived, the grandkids. It's a tradition my mother is proud of, one she talks about as evidence of how close-knit our family is, how we still do things the right way compared to families who scatter for holidays and never sit down together. The unspoken rule, established sometime in my childhood and never once revisited or renegotiated, was that whoever's birthday it was got to pick the restaurant. It sounds like a nice tradition on paper. In practice, over the years, it had quietly become something else, an opportunity, each time, for whichever sibling wasn't the birthday person to order whatever they wanted, on the assumption that someone else would be covering the bill. I traced the origin of this pattern, much later, back to my grandfather, who apparently ran birthdays the same way in his own family. As the family's primary breadwinner for decades, he'd always insisted on covering every birthday dinner himself, regardless of what anyone ordered, treating it as a point of pride rather than a burden. My mother had grown up inside that generosity and, I think, simply carried the structure of it forward into her own family without ever fully translating what it actually required, not just a willingness to pay, but the specific financial cushion to absorb any amount without a second thought, something my grandfather had, and something none of us, as adult siblings still building our own careers and households, necessarily had in the same way. I want to be honest that I didn't always notice this pattern clearly. For years, I explained away the discomfort I felt at these dinners as just being sensitive about money, or not wanting to make a big deal out of things. It took a very specific, very expensive night for me to finally see the whole shape of it. I work as a regional operations manager for a hospitality group that owns and manages a small portfolio of upscale restaurants across the state, 6 locations total, ranging from a steakhouse downtown to a coastal seafood restaurant about 40 minutes from where my family lives, a place called the Titline that had, at the time of this story, only been open for about 8 months. My job isn't glamorous in the way people sometimes assume when they hear restaurant management. It's spreadsheets, staffing schedules, vendor negotiations, quarterly reviews with each location's general manager. But it does mean I know these restaurants intimately, their margins, their systems, their relationships with vendors, and, relevant to this story, their point-of-sale software and internal billing procedures better than almost anyone outside the corporate office. My family has never shown much interest in the specifics of my job. At family gatherings, when the conversation turns to work, it tends to orbit around my brothers, Mark's promotions at his engineering firm, Trevor's growing real estate portfolio, while my job gets summarized, usually by my mother, in one flattening sentence: Danielle does something with restaurants. I stopped correcting that description years ago. It felt easier, at the time, than trying to explain the actual scope of what I did to people who'd already decided it wasn't worth asking more about. When my 33rd birthday came around, I decided, for the first time in years, to pick somewhere genuinely special rather than the reliable, moderately priced Italian place we usually defaulted to. I chose the Titline, partly because I loved the food, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me wanted my family to see, even briefly, a piece of the world I actually worked in. I called ahead myself, spoke with the general manager, a woman named Priya who I'd worked closely with since the location opened, and let her know I'd be bringing a party of 9 for my birthday. I didn't ask for any special treatment, no discount, no free courses, nothing beyond a good table and good service, which I knew, given the location's quality, would be a given regardless of who I was. "Happy early birthday," Priya told me on the phone. "We'll take good care of your family." I remember feeling genuinely excited in the days leading up to that dinner, a rare feeling, I realized later, for a family gathering that was ostensibly in my honor. I didn't yet understand how completely that excitement was about to curdle. The dinner started normally enough. My parents arrived first, then Mark and his wife Ashley, then Trevor and his wife Christine, with their kids in tow. There was the usual round of hugs, the usual comments about how nice the restaurant looked, my mother remarking, within the first 5 minutes, on how fancy the place was in a tone I couldn't quite parse as a compliment or a warning. I ordered a salad and a glass of wine. I wasn't especially hungry that night, distracted by the effort of hosting 9 people and making sure everyone was comfortable, the way I always ended up doing at these dinners despite it technically being my celebration. What I watched happen over the next hour and a half, I can only describe now as a slow, escalating group decision that none of them seemed to think required any check-in with me at all. Trevor ordered the whole Maine lobster, market price, the most expensive item on the menu. Ashley followed his lead. My father ordered 2 lobster tails as an appetizer before his main course, also lobster. My mother, not to be left out, ordered the surf and turf, lobster tail paired with a fillet. By the time the kids' meals and a round of specialty cocktails and 2 bottles of the restaurant's higher-end wine were added in, I watched, with a growing, quiet dread, as the table's collective order became something considerably more extravagant than anything I'd have imagined for a family dinner, let alone one where nobody had asked me, even once, whether this level of spending was something I'd anticipated covering. When the check arrived, the server, following what I assume was fairly standard practice, set it near the middle of the table rather than in front of any specific person. There was a brief pause, the kind of pause I now understand, looking back, was everyone else waiting to see who would move first. My mother reached across the table, picked it up, glanced at the total, and slid it directly in front of me. "You're paying, right?" she said, in a tone so casual it took me a moment to fully register what she'd actually said. "You picked the place." I looked down at the total. Just under $4,000, before tip. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, why she assumed I'd be covering the entire bill for 9 people's individual orders, several of which I hadn't even known about until the food arrived at the table. "That's how birthdays work in this family," she said, with the specific, practiced patience of someone repeating a rule she considered self-evident. "Whoever's birthday it is picks the place. Whoever picks the place pays. You know this, Danielle." I sat there, in a restaurant I had personally recommended to my family for what was supposed to be my own celebration, being told, in front of my entire family and within earshot of the staff I worked with professionally, that I was expected to cover $4,000 because of a rule I'd never actually agreed to, only ever quietly absorbed. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the specific dollar amount. This wasn't the first time this had happened. It was simply the most expensive, most undeniable version of a pattern that had been repeating, in smaller forms, for over a decade. At my 25th birthday, at a mid-range steakhouse, I'd covered a bill that came in nearly $300 over what I'd budgeted, because Trevor and his date had ordered a bottle of wine I hadn't been consulted about. At my 30th, at the Italian place we usually went to, my father had ordered a second round of drinks for the table to celebrate properly without asking whether that was something I was prepared to pay for. Each time, the overage had been modest enough that I'd absorbed it without much protest, telling myself it wasn't worth the conflict, that birthdays were supposed to be about generosity rather than itemized accounting. Sitting there with a $4,000 check in front of me, I finally understood what all those smaller instances had actually been, not isolated moments of thoughtlessness, but a consistent, unexamined family assumption that had simply been waiting for an occasion expensive enough to make itself impossible to ignore. I looked around the table. Mark, my other brother, wouldn't quite meet my eyes, which told me he understood, on some level, that this wasn't right, even if he wasn't going to say so out loud. Trevor was checking something on his phone, entirely unbothered. My father was finishing his second lobster tail, seemingly unaware that anything unusual was happening at all. "I didn't agree to pay for everyone's individual orders," I said, keeping my voice level. "I ordered a salad." I didn't know Trevor was getting the market price lobster, or that Dad was getting an extra course. Nobody asked me before ordering any of this. "It's your birthday," my mother said again, as though repeating the sentence more firmly might make it more persuasive. "This is what we do." While my mother spoke, I found myself doing quiet math in my head, the specific occupational habit of someone who spends her professional life looking at restaurant checks and margins for a living. I could see, glancing at the itemized paper ticket the server had left tucked under the folder before it became the check, roughly how the total had accumulated. Trevor's Lobster alone had run over $90 at market price that week, before his cocktails. Ashley's matching order brought their combined total past $200 before dessert. My parents' surf and turf, extra course, and bottle of wine added up to nearly as much between just the two of them. I understood, professionally, exactly how a bill reaches $4,000 for a table of 9. What I couldn't understand, sitting there as a daughter rather than as an operations manager, was how none of them had paused, even once, mid-order, to consider whether the person footing the bill had any say in what they were about to spend on her behalf. It was such a strange, specific kind of double vision, watching the numbers add up with total professional clarity, while simultaneously absorbing, on a much more personal level, what it meant that my own family hadn't extended me the same basic courtesy I extended to strangers dining at any restaurant I managed, the courtesy of assuming they'd want to know, roughly, what something was going to cost before they were asked to pay for it. I want to describe what happened in the several minutes after that, because I think it's the part of the story that matters most, even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface. I sat there, the check in front of me, my family continuing to talk around me about unrelated things, Trevor mentioning a work trip, Ashley asking Christine about a school event for the kids, as though the matter of the $4,000 bill had already been settled the moment my mother declared it settled. I felt something specific in that moment that I want to try to name accurately, because I think it's a feeling a lot of people recognize even if they've never had it attached to quite this large a number. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a quiet, sinking recognition, the same recognition I imagine happens to anyone who's spent years quietly absorbing something, only to have it suddenly presented back to them in a form too large to keep absorbing. I thought about every other time I'd paid slightly more than my share at these dinners without saying anything. I thought about how automatically my family had assumed, this time, that I'd simply do it again, on a scale nearly 10 times larger than any previous instance, without a single person at that table pausing to ask whether that assumption was fair. I excused myself to the restroom, more to collect myself than out of any actual need, and stood at the sink for a long moment, looking at my own reflection, feeling the specific vertigo of understanding a pattern all at once instead of gradually, the way I'd usually let myself understand things about my family, slowly, with plenty of room to explain each instance away individually. When I came back to the table, I didn't argue further, and I didn't pay the bill either. I did something my family, entirely reasonably, given how they'd always seen me before that night, did not expect. I flagged down our server and asked, quietly, if I could speak with the general manager for a moment. Priya came over within a few minutes, greeting me warmly, clearly still operating under the assumption that this was simply a courtesy check-in from someone she considered a valued industry contact rather than the beginning of anything unusual. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Actually," I said, "I have a request, and I understand if it's not something you can accommodate, but I wanted to ask directly rather than assume." I explained, briefly and factually, the situation, that the check had been presented to me as the sole responsible party, without my consent, for orders I hadn't authorized or even known about until they arrived at the table. Priya, to her credit, understood immediately what I was actually asking, without my needing to spell it out further. "Would you like the check split by individual order?" she asked. "We can do that easily. It just requires going back through the table's order and assigning each item." I said yes. I watched my mother's face shift, in real time, from confusion to something considerably less comfortable, as Priya explained to the table, warmly and professionally, that the bill would now be itemized and split according to what each person had actually ordered. "You're really doing this?" my mother said, once Priya had stepped away to begin the process. "In front of everyone? This is embarrassing, Danielle." What's embarrassing, I said, is being told, in front of the whole family, that I'm expected to pay $4,000 for orders I never agreed to. I think asking to pay for what I actually ordered is the reasonable part of tonight, not the embarrassing part. Trevor, finally looking up from his phone, seemed genuinely surprised, in a way that told me he truly hadn't thought through the implications of ordering market-price lobster at someone else's expense. I mean, I didn't realize you weren't planning to cover it, he said. I guess I just assumed, like Mom said, that's how it's always worked. That's exactly the problem, I said. Nobody's ever actually asked me if that's how I wanted it to work. It's just been assumed every single time, and I let it get assumed because it was easier than having this conversation at a smaller dollar amount, years ago, before it turned into this. My father, finishing his meal, finally weighed in. It's just money, Danielle. We're family. Does it really need to become a whole production? It became a production, I said, the moment everyone ordered a $4,000 dinner and then decided, without asking, that I'd be the one paying for all of it. I'm not making a scene. I'm asking to pay for my own salad. When the itemized checks came back, the numbers told their own story more clearly than any argument I could have made. My portion, the salad, the glass of wine, came to just under $42. Trevor and Ashley's combined total for their lobster and cocktails came to just over $1,100. My parents' portion, between the extra course, the surf and turf, and a bottle of wine my mother had ordered without mentioning it to anyone, came to just over $900. I watched my mother's expression as she looked at her own itemized total, a number considerably larger than anything she'd apparently expected to be asked to personally account for, given that the entire premise of the evening, in her mind, had been that all of it would simply be my responsibility as the birthday person. Nobody at the table said much while the individual payments were processed. I paid my $42, added a generous tip on my own portion, and thanked Priya sincerely on my way out, a genuine thank you, since she'd handled an uncomfortable situation with real professionalism, understanding exactly what was actually happening without my needing to explain the full family history behind it. Nobody spoke much in the parking lot afterward. My mother gave me a stiff, brief hug goodbye, the kind reserved for moments when someone isn't sure whether they're still allowed to be affectionate. Trevor mumbled something like happy birthday, for real, on his way to his car, seeming, if not fully apologetic, at least genuinely unsettled by how the evening had gone. Mark caught me alone for a moment before I got in my car. I should have said something at the table, he said. I've thought the same thing you said tonight, more than once, over the years. I just never said it out loud, because it felt easier not to. I understand, I told him. I did the same thing for years. I just ran out of room to keep doing it tonight. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after finally naming a pattern that had cost me thousands of dollars, cumulatively, over more than a decade. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt tired, and a little sad, and something close to relief, all mixed together in a way that didn't resolve into any single clean emotion. The family group chat, over the following days, became its own small window into how differently everyone had processed that night. My mother posted first, the next morning, a message that read, in part, I think we all need to be more mindful about money at these dinners going forward. It's important we don't let things get out of hand. No acknowledgement of her own role in the specific dynamic that had gotten things out of hand in the first place, just a general, diffuse statement of concern that implicated everyone equally, which is to say, implicated no one specifically. Trevor sent a message a few hours later, more direct than I expected, sorry for not thinking that through, Danny. Should have realized that wasn't fair to just assume. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was honest, and I appreciated it more than I expected to. Christine, Trevor's wife, sent a private message to me separately, later that week, admitting that she'd felt uncomfortable with the ordering the whole time but hadn't wanted to say anything in front of everyone. I think a lot of us have felt weird about this for years, she wrote. I'm glad someone finally said something. That message, more than almost anything else that happened afterward, confirmed something I'd started to suspect during the drive home, that I wasn't the only person at that table who'd noticed the pattern. I was simply the only one who'd finally, after over a decade, refused to keep absorbing it quietly. The real test of whether anything had actually changed came several months later, at Trevor's birthday, the next occasion where the family tradition would normally apply. I want to say clearly that I wasn't looking for revenge, or waiting to catch anyone in a repeat of what had happened at my dinner. What I was genuinely curious about was whether the conversation my itemized bill had forced into the open would translate into any real, lasting change in how the family approached these gatherings, or whether it would simply become an awkward memory nobody wanted to repeat but also nobody wanted to actually discuss. At Trevor's dinner, at a restaurant he'd chosen himself, something noticeably different happened before anyone even ordered. My father, unprompted, said, "Let's just do individual checks tonight, easier for everyone," a suggestion that would have been unthinkable, I think, without the specific memory of my birthday still fresh enough in everyone's mind to make the old assumption feel risky rather than automatic. Nobody argued. The dinner proceeded normally, everyone ordering roughly what they'd have ordered anyway, and the bill, when it came, was split cleanly among individual orders without a single moment of tension. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Nobody gave a speech about lessons learned. But it was, I think, the clearest evidence I got that the pattern itself, once named directly and expensively enough, had actually been disrupted rather than simply weathered as an unpleasant one-time incident. About 6 months after my birthday, my mother and I had lunch together, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in a long time. Partway through the meal, without much preamble, she brought up that night directly for the first time since it happened. "I've thought about your birthday a lot," she said. "I think I've always assumed birthdays worked a certain way in this family because that's how it worked when I was growing up, whoever hosted, paid, no matter how much anyone else spent. I never really questioned whether that made sense with grown children who all have their own money and their own opinions about how much lobster is reasonable to order at someone else's expense." I laughed, despite myself, at that last part, and I think she appreciated that I did. "I'm not asking you to apologize again," I told her. "I think what happened that night mattered more than any apology would. But I appreciate you saying this now, honestly. I don't think I handled it well, in the moment," she admitted. "I think my first instinct was embarrassment, that everyone was watching this happen at the table, and instead of actually listening to what you were saying, I got defensive about how it looked rather than whether it was fair. I've thought about that a lot since. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, the kind you might see in a more cinematic version of this story. It was quieter than that, more honest, the specific kind of accountability that happens months later, over lunch, once the initial defensiveness has had time to wear off and something closer to genuine reflection has had room to take its place. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I stopped attending family dinners altogether, that the $4,000 lobster bill became the final straw in some larger family rupture. It didn't, and I think it's more honest to say so plainly. What actually happened was smaller, and in its own way, more useful. I learned that a pattern doesn't stop just because it makes you uncomfortable to notice it. It stops when you're willing to name it clearly, at the actual moment it's happening, in a way specific enough that it can't be smoothed over or reabsorbed into vague generalities about being more careful going forward. I used to think the polite thing to do, at family gatherings, was to avoid conflict at almost any cost, to quietly absorb an unfair bill rather than risk an uncomfortable scene in front of everyone. I've since learned that absorbing something quietly doesn't actually avoid conflict. It just postpones it, and lets it compound, until eventually the version of the conflict that finally surfaces is bigger, more expensive, and more embarrassing for everyone than any of the smaller conversations that could have prevented it years earlier. I don't think my family set out, at any single one of those earlier birthdays, to take advantage of me specifically. I think a habit formed early, went unexamined for over a decade because I let it go unexamined, and eventually grew large enough that a $4,000 dinner became necessary to finally force the conversation nobody had wanted to have at $300, or even at $900. This year, at my 34th birthday dinner, back at the Titterline again by my own choice, something happened that I think captures how much had genuinely shifted since the year before. Before anyone ordered, my father turned to me and asked, directly, "Are we doing individual checks again, or did you want to handle it differently this year?" A simple, ordinary question that would have been entirely unthinkable at any family dinner before the lobster incident, as I've started calling it privately, with more humor than bitterness at this point. "Individual checks are great," I said. "Order whatever you want. Just know what you're ordering." Everyone laughed, including me, in a way that felt genuinely lighter than anything that had happened at that same restaurant 1 year earlier. Trevor ordered the lobster again, this time cheerfully announcing it to the table before he did, as though checking in had simply become the new, obvious way to do things, rather than a concession forced by conflict. "Getting the lobster again," he said. "This time I'm paying for it myself, obviously." It was such a small moment, in the context of everything that had happened the year before, but it stayed with me longer than I expected it to, the simple, previously unthinkable sight of my brother ordering exactly what he wanted while also, without any tension at all, taking full ownership of what that order would cost him. If there's a lesson in this, it's a smaller one than the dollar figure might suggest, but I believe it completely. The patterns that quietly cost you the most, in families or anywhere else, are rarely announced clearly enough to notice all at once. They accumulate in increments small enough to explain away individually, a slightly overpriced bottle of wine here, an extra course there, until something happens that's expensive enough, or clear enough, to finally force the whole shape of it into view. I don't regret paying more than my fair share at those earlier birthdays. I think, at the time, I genuinely believed I was keeping the peace, choosing generosity over conflict in a way that felt, in each individual instance, like the right call. What I'd underestimate, every single time, was how much that individual generosity was quietly compounding into an unspoken family expectation, one that would eventually assume, without asking, that I'd cover $4,000 of lobster nobody had checked with me about first. I still love these dinners. I still look forward to my birthday, and to picking somewhere I genuinely want to go. But I no longer assume that generosity and silence are the same thing, or that keeping the peace requires absorbing costs, financial or otherwise, that were never actually mine to absorb in the first place. If you've ever had to finally name a pattern in your own family that had been quietly costing you for years, I'd love to hear how you did it, and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.